first review of Season 5. We good to go? You are listening to E-Radio by Missed Apex. We are electric. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the E-Radio Show, brought to you by the Missed Apex podcast. I'm your host, Matt Trumpets, and today's episode is called When It Rains, It Pours. I'm here today with ace journalist Chris _Stevens. How's it going today, Chris?
Yeah, it's going fantastic, Matt. I mean, it's true what you say. When it rains, it does pour in Diriyah. They get 1 day of rain in December, apparently, and we got it all.
What were the odds, right? Well, before we go any further, I need to remind everyone that we are an independent podcast produced in the podcasting shed with the kind permission of our better halves. We aim to bring you a race review before your Monday morning commute. We might be wrong, but we're first. And we live stream our race reviews now. For those of you who are on the live stream, you will know that is happening. So be sure to subscribe to E-Radio Show on YouTube so you get a notification when we go live, so you can join our live chat room as well, which will no doubt be almost as much fun as watching the actual race. And you're not the only person with us today. We also have today a very special guest from his very own podcasting shed, none other than ace host of Missed Apex Radio, and I hear he might have a radio show himself, Spanners Ready. How's it going, Spanners?
I don't know if I've mentioned my radio show at any point, Trumpets. Thank you very much for inviting me on this race review. I am a big fan in general of Formula E. However, I did fall off the bandwagon last season, but I've jumped back in for these new Gen 2 cars, so I am looking forward to talking about it.
Excellent. Well, what say we get started? So, before we get into talking about the specifics of the race, what were your general impressions? And why don't we start with you, Spanner, since you are the fan they are looking to convert?
Obviously, a lot of new features, so I guess I get to pick my first thing to talk about. I think the most dramatic change has been the shape of the cars. Now, one of the things that concerned me about Formula E was how they protect the wheels. And Chris and I were discussing whether this is truly an open wheel series. Now, it looks like to me those front wings are quite robust now, more like a sports car bumper, which fundamentally changes what the sport is. So it's certainly not like Formula One, where they have to really protect their front wing. You're not going to get the Hamilton-Rosberg in Spa 2014, where just that littlest touch means a trip back to the pits.
Of course, all the parts on the cars, they're to reduce drag, but it does also look really cool as well. And I like the fact that it's not aero sensitive, because it means that the cars can run closely together, but you can actually get away with a light bump every now and then.
Well, they can get rid of, they can take more than a light bump. I mean, there was quite a few instances in the race of people nudging someone from the rear quarter and sending them sort of squiffy.
You can't actually get away with that anymore, because the rear diffuser is so massive and sticks out of the rear of the car so much. It'll damage the car if you do that. So, I mean, you'd get away with it if you were nudging someone else, but not if you're the guy being nudged.
Well, I'll tell you what struck me, and this is an odd thing, because I did see the Gen 2 cars in Brooklyn last summer, is that on TV, I actually don't like the way the nose goes back to the cockpit. It looks like that angle gets wider than I would like it to. But you also need to bear in mind that I'm an adult human who, if my wife doesn't tell me my clothes don't match, I would walk out of the door wearing things that were completely inappropriate. So take that for what it's worth.
Where do you think they want to go, Chris? Do you think they want this to be like a single-seater series where they really have to guard the wheels? Or is it just a necessity given the narrow street tracks, and that's the philosophy they've driven themselves down? They need to protect these cars from contact. I mean, if the front wings disintegrated for every contact, we would have had a lot more pit lane action.
Well, the point of, Formula E is to provide entertainment as well. So having a whole bunch of aerodynamics on the car just to make them quicker, A, is going to detract from the racing, and B, this is an engine formula, not an aero formula, so it's redundant anyway. But the main reason is for aerodynamic purposes and reducing drag, so that you get maximum efficiency from the drivetrains.
Okay, so we've talked a lot about what the cars look like, but what do we think of the actual racing? I mean, we had attack mode for the first time. There's still fan boost. So I mean, what was your impression? You watched a whole race. What did you think, Chris?
I know me and Spanners are going to disagree on this one, which is very much the ethos of Missed Apex and E-Radio. But I have to say I'm unconvinced by it. I still think that the earlier ideas they had of just using different power modes would have been good enough without the need for driving over a specific piece of tarmac, gaining access to it, and losing time. Yeah, it adds an extra element to it, but I found myself looking at the sort of timing tower on the left hand side more than I was looking at the actual racing, which I felt detracted from it slightly.
I think it's magnificent. I'm so happy they've gone down this route. So my wife has this annoying habit of she'll have the radio on, but only so you can just about hear it and you don't even know what song's on or if there's talking or not. And I say to her, up or off. That's my argument with her with that radio. Up or off. And the same thing with fan boost and extra power. Up or off. Like, I was a little unsatisfied with the effect fan boost had, given all the marketing that went into it and all the effort that went into picking who gets fan boost. It didn't really have that much of an effect on the racing. So I'm glad they've decided to kind of go all in and say, we have the technology to give cars extra power. If you wanted to do that in F1, you would have to like bolt on another fuel tank and say, all right, if you drive over the line, that releases this fuel tank's hose and you get a bit more power. Whereas in Formula E, they've got the technology. There's no reason not to use something like this to mix it up, especially on a street track, because street tracks suck. It does give you that extra element. And I loved the strategic elements that it brought into the race. So, for example, Chris, the guys that used it when they were leading a pack really missed out because then they would lose a position. But the guys that were stuck behind a car where they had more pace, but they couldn't quite get past, they took a little bit of a penalty, got their attack mode, caught up, and then were actually able to pass. So attack mode has made a real difference to the racing. So I'm really glad they've done it.
Well, I think using different power modes just in general without the need for going offline would have done the same anyway. I will say that the drivers weren't too keen on it around this track anyway. As much as I think they love the concept, they didn't, when they actually got in and used it, they didn't like the fact that I've just lost time. I don't like the fact that I've just lost time. I don't want to lose time at all. I just want to gain time, which of course you get back with the extra power, but they don't want to be losing time full stop. And I think around this track in particular, there are really only 2, maybe 3 overtaking spots. So maybe it will work better on a track like Marrakesh, for example.
But they only lost the time temporarily, and that only really penalised them if that meant giving up a place. How would you feel if the attack mode thing was like in the middle of a straight? Because obviously here they had to sacrifice some exit speed so they could mostly make it back. Obviously not all the cars made it when they tried to break those attack mode timing beams. But that seemed like quite an awkward positioning of it. Is that deliberate, do you think? Have they made it so there's a penalty for doing it?
Yeah, totally. The idea is you lose seconds doing it. And I will say where they placed it in at Diriyah maybe wasn't the most elegant solution. I think what a lot of people was more imagining was, say, taking a wider line around a hairpin, for example, rather than trying to sacrifice an exit, because what it does as well is it's a little bit more dangerous because you have to go slower into the corner. And of course, if you're in a pack and the guy behind you doesn't know you're about to take the attack mode, then you could go into the back of him.
We've got a chat room here as well, Matt, on E-Radio. And if they search E-Radio Show on YouTube and subscribe and click a bell, they'll get a notification every time we go live. But we've got some people talking to us. Do you want to hear from them, Matt?
Yeah, but I think our stream just crashed, so I don't know what's... Oh, no, we're back. Go ahead.
Richard Mundell, and hello, Richard, says, I'd love to see them race on a proper circuit. I think if we put them even somewhere like Brands Hatch at the moment, it would expose too much and it would take away from the concept of Formula E. Do you not think that's the case, Chris? I mean, if they could put them on a real racetrack, if you like, would it not put a lot of people off?
Well, first of all, Marrakesh, Mexico City are the two permanent facilities that are actually used on the Formula E calendar. But you say Brands Hatch. It's interesting you bring that one up because that was actually mooted as a potential UK race as a London replacement. So I think on the right circuit, it would be great.
Yeah, that's interesting. And I would personally love to see, I agree with Richard, I would love to see these cars racing over like proper circuits with curbing and runoff area.
But of course, it detracts from the ethos of like the EV, which is that it lives in the city centre, and that's where they should be.
Chris, I think they only did that because initially it was too slow, and they were forced to go on street tracks to do that. But anyway, sorry, Trumpets, but the live stream is also saying red shells next year, says Jamie Ryan, perhaps suggesting that the attack mode is a bit of a novelty. I don't agree. I think it is Formula E playing to its strengths.
Well, hold on to your hat because I'm going to agree with you on this one. I like the attack mode. It's like push to pass, but not exactly. It advantages you if you're at the back, as you said, if you're at the back of a pack, it gives you a little bit of an advantage. But what does it really put the premium on strategically? How good are you at overtaking? Which is what Formula E, if Formula E has an advantage over Formula One, it's that there's lots more overtaking and the action is a lot closer. And I will say, having watched the first race, I really am waiting for the day that they can either run at 250 for the race and have 300 for qualifying, or they can reduce the weight of the battery enough they can lose about 100 kilograms, because either one would just be, that would be the sweet spot, because those cars looked really fast in qualifying. Sometimes in the race, they seemed a little bit, they still seem just a tiniest bit slow. Much better, much faster than last season, though.
Hey, Matt, I've got some general gripes about the broadcast, but I'm assuming you want me to save it for any other business at the end.
Yeah, you and me both. Although I will say that the user experience, if you watched after the race, was far superior to watching during the race. What say we go, speaking of races, and talk about what actually happened? Okay, so Chris Stevens, can you tell us where the race was won and lost?
The biggest deciding factor in this race was the fact that the heavens opened on Saturday morning and over Friday night as well. The mother of all thunderstorms, apparently, that caused the circuit to be flooded in certain areas because the drainage was just overfilling and they couldn't get out for FP1. That was cancelled, and then they tried to combine two sessions, and then that was cancelled. They ended up agreeing on a 35-minute session that in actuality was really only 15 minutes because there was a very lengthy red flag period. So 15 minutes of running was all these guys had before they went into qualifying. And that just was the first domino that led to so many controversial things later on in the race. Because when you have a severe lack of running like that, throw on top of the fact that this track was a lot more undulating and crucially bumpier than they expected, certainly more than it showed in their simulations, you come up with the issue of software calibration, which might be too technical a term for one of our shows for once, but it was an interesting concept that ended up cropping up later because we saw all these post-qualifying and these mid-race penalties that ultimately can be traced back to the lack of calibrating software. So to go into the details, Antonio Felix da Costa's maiden Formula E pole position was a sublime lap, and Techeetah actually in qualifying trim didn't look all that quick, did they? Verne was in the lower fringes of the top 10. Lotterer was just about there. They got a bit lucky with some of those post-qualifying penalties, bumped them off the grid a little bit. But then they looked so fast in the race, didn't they?
Yeah, they really did. They looked to have the dominant car. I was surprised by not just the technical infringements that we saw, because you would expect that with such limited running, and we see similar things in Formula One, but I was surprised by Neo chucking Dillman out for like 10 practice laps at the beginning of qualifying. Have we had an explanation as to why they thought the rule had changed from last year to this year?
I guess because the format was changed because of the weather conditions and how limited the running was. So the idea of just letting them do as many laps at 200 kilowatts as they wanted before going up to 250, that was an idea that was sort of mooted by a lot of the drivers. So I guess Neo then assumed, right, well, this is what they're doing for qualifying then, before it was sort of officially confirmed otherwise.
Basically, they didn't take proper notes at the meeting. Is that what I'm getting?
It might have been a miscommunication by the FIA themselves as well, or by Formula E. So let's not blame Neo in its entirety.
Yeah, that said, I have to admit, it was a pretty impressive thing for them to be able to turn around, come up with a format the teams all more or less agreed to, and get it running, given how visibly impacted the entire circuit was. And did that apply to the broadcasting equipment too? Do we know? But certainly the racetrack still had like standing water on it when they opened up first practice.
I couldn't tell you if it affected the broadcast quality at all. I know that there were quite a few issues, having seen the entire thing. There were a few issues here or there. I couldn't tell you if that was related to the weather, though.
All right, so outline it for us. What was the grid? Da Costa was first, but who were the places behind him? And then let's get on to the race.
Can I interrupt? Because Da Costa was nearly zeroth, wasn't he? He was nearly zero on the grid.
Because he overshot it, yeah. That was incredible.
Doesn't that make Formula E look a little silly that the guys couldn't even get on the grid? Everyone around that track and watching was face palming. But I mean, credit, he didn't panic. He reversed it and nearly got it straight. But he was pointing at the wall to start with. And so little things like that, you might just want to shake them out and do a little bit more practice on the grids just to make it look good.
I mean, it's not unusual. I've certainly seen weirder things on a starting grid. But to run back to Matt's point, I got to say that the top performances from Jose Maria Lopez to get on the front row for Dragon, which I was not expecting, and Stoffel Van Dorn was the star of qualifying, wasn't he? On his debut, wasn't he, in the HWA, fifth that turned into fourth when Dillman got chucked out. So that was really, really impressive. But yeah, going into the race, those Tachitas just really came through the field, and they just looked like, certainly against the cars they were competing against, to have an advantage. But I think there may have been an appearance there that made them look a lot better, because if you looked at the cars they were competing against, the Nissan, Edams, and the Dragon, when the energy levels showed up, those were the two cars that were struggling the most, I'd say. Whereas the Tachita, as you'd expect, wasn't. So I think maybe they looked a little bit better than they were. But I will say, he passed Acosta for the lead a lot more easily than I expected him to.
Yeah, he did. And as far as getting to the grid, well, we've certainly seen people crash on the way to the grid. So I suppose there's that to compare it to. But the start, and this is, I think, my biggest disappointment, is I've really gotten, in a lot of ways, used to thinking of Formula E as a little bit bumper cars, but in a good way, rubbing as racing kind of a way. And I didn't see as much of that this time around. So is it because everyone's being slightly more careful because they don't have a spare car to jump into?
Well, I think it might be because there's a lot more options to pass. So there's not that same desperation, Chris. I don't know, maybe knowing that you might have your opportunity in attack mode means you don't have to quite slam it down the inside of a car in front.
I think it's a credit to the quality of the field because they know that Formula E races can get pretty crazy. There's no point just throwing everything on the line, especially in the first race of the season, by making some desperate move at turn one that may or may not pay off and end up, ruining your race. Because you can't just jump into the second car now and try a Hail Mary strategy. So there is that to contend with, because they're also being a lot more careful in practice now. They can't afford a huge shunt anymore like that.
Right. So the early part of the race, though, like you said, I mean, Techeetah just looked very, very dominant, but we did have a crash or two, didn't we?
There was Mortara in the wall that one. A lot of braking issues for him and Venturi. Same issue that he had in the practice. He was the one who brought the red flag out.
Now, you told me, I think on our last show, that DS are the only team that have developed their own brake-by-wire. Did they have any braking issues?
No, if anything, they looked far better on the brakes than most teams, didn't they?
Yeah, they kind of did. That's sort of interesting. That's a testament, I guess, to the team and the people who developed the software. But that's a surprise, because I wouldn't have guessed that before the race began.
So one of the strongest teams on the brakes looked like Techeetah for me. So if you looked at Vern and his passes on Da Costa, or his attempted passes on Da Costa, he seemed to have so much more control under the brakes. And when he was going around the outside of Da Costa had sort of quite sensibly defended the inside line. But Vern had that confidence on the brakes to go, no, I'm going to go round the outside. I can slam it on as hard as I could. And then when he starts trail braking, that car is snapping and turning and gripping, and they just looked so much more confident under braking. And obviously, I don't know any of the technicalities behind it, but do you think that is car or driver, Chris?
I think car, because driver's got to have confidence in his car that it's going to do that. That being said, what I praised Jeb for last season was the strides he made in his energy management, and I think there's a lot of impact because of the strategy and the way you approach a corner, especially overtaking in Formula E, so much to do with lift and coast. It's so much often a case of, I'm just going to lift less than you on this particular straight and just brake a little bit later and make that huge gain. And I suppose if we're talking like technically as well, by that stage of the race, they're not using the brakes to slow down the car. They're using the regen paddle and actually slowing the car down through the regeneration systems. So I guess the way that the car handles at a lower battery level compared to when it's fully charged up, when you are using the brakes, is very, very strong.
That's quite hard for us muggles to follow. That's going to be quite a steep learning curve for a lot of new Formula E fans. But just from the outside looking at it, those Techeetahs looked like they could dance in a way that those other cars couldn't. And I know Vern is probably one of the class drivers of the field, but it was quite stark seeing how he and Lotterer could make up time even after their penalties.
Yeah, and I mean, well, speaking of, that was the disaster for them, wasn't it? Running first and third when they get hit with a drive-through for using too much regen. It was I know it only came up technical infringement on the timing, but it was for exceeding the 250 kilowatts of regen that you're allowed.
And that was back down to you think mainly just the lack of running in practice. It's something they would have noticed and adjusted in the software if they'd had a regular practice session.
No, exactly. If you look at the other penalties that were handed out, they were all for power spikes in qualifying, or using too much regen, or a charging in infringement. That are all things that are sort of down to software calibration. Is the software will, if you hit a particularly hard bump and you get a bit of wheel slip, properly calibrated software will stop you from actually going over 250 kilowatts of power, because the cars are capable of doing it, but they're limited to it. So you need to have a buffer there to stop it going over there. when it sort of breaks traction a little bit. Whereas if you don't have it calibrated properly, then it can go over that. Like we saw with Techeetah, the very same team, after qualifying for the New York finale last season, that, let's be honest, it cost them the team's title against Audi because they had to start right at the back.
It did, and that had to sting a little bit because that was a brand new software update that they probably, looking in hindsight, probably didn't even need to implement. And I had the exact same thought when I first heard it. I was like, oh man, again. But I guess if you're going to push, you're going to push. And that seems to be what they like to do, at least on the software side. So you mentioned other penalties for spikes. Who else picked up a penalty besides the Lauderer and Verne for this sort of infringement?
So Felipe Massa and Gary Paffett had the same one for the regen. Alexander Sims also picked up 2 penalties for the power spikes. That wasn't on the regen. That was the actual power coming out of the car where he went over 200 kilowatts it is in the race.
All right. So, but that set the stage for an amazing finish, really, with the leader. And was Lauderer in 3rd or 4th at that point?
He was in 3rd, but what really sort of created the finale was the safety car that came out for Jose Maria Lopez Stricken Dragon. That really put Verne back in the hunt because he didn't lose an awful lot of time going through the pits. It's relatively short pit lane they had, I think. So didn't lose an awful lot of time. And then, of course, the safety car just puts you right back into play. But also what it does, with the new timed format, you save so much more energy under a safety car period because you're covering a lot less distance now. Before, when you ran to a certain number of laps, you were still covering the same amount of distance. You saved a little bit of energy because you were running at a reduced pace. But the clock is still ticking at the same rate now, and you've just saved so much more energy, and it allows you to go so much harder towards the end of the race.
Yeah, I have to admit, I'm still trying to wrap my brain around the differences between running to a time plus 1 lap and running to a set number of laps. But what did you think of that, Spanners? Did you find that exciting, the safety car, and then all the energy they had to play with? Or do you miss the old days of, look, there's 3% and he's just started the last lap. Will they get to the finish line?
I want purity of motorsport with no gimmicks. No, I'm only kidding. I like the gimmicks. My wondering was whether Formula E would have a kind of American philosophy where, yeah, sure, actually, for the sake of a show, if it's 50-50 on the fence, do we throw out a full course yellow? Do we throw out a safety car for the sake of the show? But they were under yellow flag conditions for quite a long time trying to rescue that car, and then they went to safety car. So I think that was probably the right call, but I'm wondering whether the organization, whether the people running Formula E don't mind the odd safety car, because it does take away one of the key weaknesses, which is obviously trying to make that battery power last for a whole race. If they can get a safety car every other race, that will make for a lot tighter finishes, and it will make for cars going a lot faster at the end. If you were a cynic, you might say, yeah, do you know what? If it's 50-50, if it's a coin flip, just get the old safety car out.
This isn't NASCAR. We don't throw out a caution every 200 laps.
But they have shown themselves to be not adverse to breaking the traditional motorsport rules. So they're quite happy to have red shells. I mean, attack mode. Why not be quite happy to do things for the show? I'm not saying it's a criticism at all of this particular event. I think it was a no-brainer. That car was at the end of a blind corner, wasn't it? So they weren't going to recover that with cars coming past, even under virtual safety car, if you like. I don't know what the term is here.
Yeah, once I saw where it was parked, because you were on board with the car when you first saw where it was parked. And honestly, I'm amazed no one smashed into him, because it's very, very difficult to get out of a corner with that much speed at that late into the corner. And I'm also quite surprised they didn't just throw the safety car out immediately once they saw where he was parked.
But I just want to touch on Matt and you mentioning, there's 37 minutes plus 1 lap. I don't like that at all. Can we just all be clever enough to figure out that once the timing finishes, you're going to either finish that lap or there's going to be another lap after that, to constantly say, and we're into this race with 10 minutes plus 1 lap left. I found that clumsy. I did not like it. Not a fan. 7 out of 10.
You wouldn't like a lot of club racing then. I wouldn't recommend that to you. Without the safety car involved, it does open up the strategic element because you now have to run to the leader's pace. You have to estimate how many laps the leader is going to do and how long the race is actually going to be. It opens up the door to a lot of quite strategic errors and potentially a few more climactic finales that formerly has not been lacking. But you could throw the extra one out there. The one weakness with this format, I find, is the safety car, which unfortunately was the thing that was exploited in this race.
Can I clarify this then for people who were confused? Because I think that, say the race is 45 minutes, when 45 minutes finishes, the leader is at some point on the track, say halfway. Does that mean that is the last lap? Or does that mean the next time he crosses the start-finish line, that is the start of the next lap?
No, so whenever the timer clocks down to 0, you have one more lap after that.
Wait a minute. So if I'm halfway around the lap and
Yes.
it goes down to 0, I finish the lap I'm on.
Yep.
And then I get the white flag for the last lap.
Yes.
Okay, there we go.
Yeah, but you know what? I interestingly agree with the point you were apparently not making at all there, Spanners, in that watching the broadcast is a thing. I would have liked a lot more. We're on lap 10. We're on lap 12. We're on lap 15. Sometimes they put up a graphic with the lap the leader was on and then the gaps to the rest of the field. I thought that was really brilliant and made it a lot easier to keep track of, because I don't want to have to keep track of, what's the average lap length in this race and how many more times are we going to go around exactly. I just want to know we're on lap 13 when the person hit the wall,
I'm with you.
All right, groovy. So we're talking about that, but the safety car came out. Now, as a spectator, what did you think of the finish of that race? Was that the kind of thing that you would actually tune in to see again?
Me? Yeah.
Yeah,
definitely. I liked seeing, obviously, a faster car hounding down a slower car, and that's what we got. But you were only in that situation because of the Techeetah penalties. If you hadn't had those, we'd have just been watching John-Eric Verne disappear into the distance, Chris.
Right. So, did Techeetah throw away an easy win? That's the kind of point, because you've just said it there, Spanners, where he would have walked away with that. The people in the chat room are saying, is Jev going to walk away with this title? And I am here to say no, that will not happen for various reasons.
Well, can I give you my perspective then first, Chris?
Go on.
As a less educated in Formula One fella, they looked so dominant. And the way they caught back up after those penalties was frightening. And you could see physically through the corners how much better that car looked. You are going to have to do a lot to convince me that Jev is not going to run away. And obviously, he did look a little half a step ahead of Lotterer as well.
No one is going to deny that Techeetah looked fantastic, as did BMW. Maybe not quite as good in race trim as the Techeetah. But first of all, because that safety car came out, we don't know how that race was going to play out. It could have been that Verne was eating up a little bit more energy than DaCosta, and DaCosta would have come back at him later in the race. We're not going to know how in a straight fight that battle was going to pan out. Also, there are so many teams that we did not see the potential of. Audi and Virgin being the very top of my list, because 8th and 9th, that is not where you would expect the reigning teams champions to be, especially when they had the best car at the end of last season.
And I think 8th and 9th flattered them, quite frankly. They were fortunate that they were the retirements and that that things played out the way they did in the race, because I could have seen them both without a points finish, quite honestly.
Now, fair enough, Degrassi was compromised because he was one of the drivers afflicted in qualifying by the power spike penalties that were handed out. So he ended up being demoted to the back of the grid, and actually to come back up to 9th is a sort of testament to how strong the car can be. Daniel Abt, on the other hand, really, really struggled. But then again, we're still talking about, the 15 minutes of practice that they had, essentially, with just no setup time either. Those cars were not optimized. It was basically a lottery to whether you had a good car for this track or not at that point. And so this will not be the same in Marrakesh. Mark my words.
Spanners?
Well, I was just looking, reminding myself of who drives for which team, because it was not immediately obvious to me as somebody who was just jumping back into this series. And what it lacked in the broadcast was any kind of very quick labeling, whereas on a Formula One broadcast, you might very quickly get a graphic up that says, this is Grosjean. That wasn't happening. I found it actually quite hard to keep track of everybody. But seeing the Virgins not doing amazingly well, was that down to no running as well?
Well, so they've been afflicted by this more than most because, of course, they haven't had 15 days of private testing because they're not a manufacturer anymore. So they were going into this a bit more blind than other teams anyway, because they would have had 3 days of preseason testing in Valencia, and they were given 3 days by Audi as well. But that's still insignificant compared to what the other manufacturers are packing by the time that they get to the first race. Throw on top of the fact that Audi's software issues are also their issues because they're running the same powertrain. So they were also afflicted by post-qualifying penalties. And I would have been, you would have been surprised to see Audi barely in the points and Virgin just ahead in this kind of scenario.
I think it might be time for me to ask for a bit of a primer. Obviously, you guys have been podcasting about Formula E since the beginning. We've been covering this since season 1, and I was on this podcast as well for the first 3 seasons. I have lost track a little bit. Could I ask who you think are the title contenders and who are the drivers for them? So we've got Techeetah, which is Vernon Lotterer, and is Da Costa going to be a feature in this title fight with the BMW Andretti Motorsport car?
100%. We have been waiting since day one of Formula E for BMW's arrival, and everything, for the last 2 or 3 years has been building up towards their first season with Andretti. Da Costa is an amazing talent, as is Alexander Sims. He will be up there with Da Costa. He just got so unlucky in this race with all the penalties he picked up, and the fact that his qualifying lap was blocked as well, which meant he was starting down the field anyway. So he will be right up there. BMW are 100% going to be in this for multiple race wins, I think. So I would expect them to have somewhat of a title challenge as well. And Audi are going to get their act together. This was a bad race for them, so Audi are 100% going to be up there. So you've got to throw Virgin into the equation as well. And I'll be surprised if we don't see, a lot of other like Mahindra throw in a title challenge in there as well. And then just throw in a bunch of teams that can score podiums just to complicate things.
Yeah, I would tend to agree with you. You can't write off Audi. BMW, Andretti really surprised me. They had been so nowhere for so long. I thought they would do better, but I really didn't see them winning a race. I'm not sure they would have won a race without the safety car and the penalties, but that's okay because they seem to be there or thereabouts. What I'd like to know is, how do we feel about, we look at the first race, if we're going to look back at the first race, like, who are my winners, who are my losers, and like, what was the biggest surprise? I think, one of the biggest surprises for me had to be BMW doing so well. I mean, we know Da Costa is good, but I was surprised to see the car do that well.
No, I wasn't at all. This is all what we've been leading up for, and especially that had such good preseason testing as well, where just everything ran so smooth for them, and BMW did not wait this long to come into the championship and then try and pick it up for 2 years. They came at this point to win straight away, which is exactly what they've done. So, no, BMW winning on debut doesn't surprise me one bit.
I'm surprised because we've seen other manufacturers come in and not do as well. So, yeah.
Well, see, here's the big difference between what BMW have done and say what Jaguar did.
Right.
Because Jaguar formed an entirely new team. They were coming back to motorsport after a 14-year hiatus outside of motorsport. So they had to gather entirely new staff to put together a racing team and then learn about this brand new series by designing its own powertrain right from the get-go. BMW, on the other hand, partnered with Andretti a few years ago, started integrating their engineers into the team understanding the series that they're in. All the meanwhile, they've been building the powertrain for this season in the background and have been putting together all the expertise and the knowledge over the last 2 years. So although you haven't seen the work come out straight away, on the face of it and on the racetrack, like you did with Jaguar when they were learning and building up as a team, they've come into it. And so the first thing that is visible to you as a viewer is the win. That's the difference between what BMW done and Jaguar did.
Yeah, fair enough. So tell us, how did our ex-F1 rookies do in their first races? I mean, I know Van Dorn really impressed me with his qualifying run because nobody in that group came anywhere close to his time.
Yeah, there was that because a few drivers got blocked by Felix Rosenqvist, who had a transmission issue, slammed it into the wall, and a red flag was wrongly shown. And so several drivers backed out of the lap and then never got a second chance at a run. And that was top contenders as well. Both the Jaguars, Sims, as I mentioned. So in terms of that group, maybe not so much, but to be P4 on the grid in your first race in those kind of conditions, in a car that we're not expecting to be at the sharp end of the grid, and you could tell it was out of position the way he slipped back, because everyone was saying, "Oh, why is Van Dorn slipping so far back? He really hasn't got his touch. He's just as washed up as he was in F1, and we're never going to see the GP2 star Stoffel Van Dorn ever again." No, Van Dorn was just slipping back to the position that car belonged in. People were saying he had problems in the race. Yeah, his problem was that it's his team's debut.
Okay, stupid question time. I feel that's my job on E-Radio when I jump on at the moment. Van Dorn is racing for HWA Race Lab. Now, that is the Mercedes-backed team. That's right, isn't it? So why haven't Mercedes just come into FE and then just dominated it?
Because they want their team that's running operations at the racetrack to be fully up to scratch with how to run a Formula E team before they come in with all the expensive kit. So basically coming in and learning as a customer for a year, because what they're getting out of their Venturi partnership, it's a 100% open relationship they have with Venturi, where a lot of information is shared. Venturi benefit from it and Mercedes benefit from it. There are a lot of big links between them and Venturi, a lot of similar sponsors, similar personnel between a lot of the teams that Mercedes have in other motorsports. So DTM, for example, ZF, who make a lot of the parts on the Venturi powertrain, which is what HWA is running. So it makes a lot of sense that they would partner with them and learn before they come in as a full works entry.
Is it worth comparing him to his teammate? Does that give us a better impression? Or are we wasting our time trying to get an impression of how Van Dorn's done in his first race in a new series?
No, it's a fair effort because, of course, Gary Paffett is a rookie as well. As he may be the reigning DTM champion, but he's a Formula E rookie. But this race is really, really tough to make comparisons just because of the format was thrown out the window, and you couldn't make any proper comparisons between drivers, between teams, based on what we saw.
It's really interesting, though, isn't it? Seeing two guys who were in F1 last year making that leap over to Formula E. And it's not like, this is Jenson Button, who's been out for a year, or Juan Pablo Montoya coming in and doing it. These are current guys who would have liked to have stayed in Formula One, who arguably would have had the pace and certainly have the credentials to have got to Formula One in the first place, saying, actually, Formula E is a good place for me to plant my flag and continue doing my racing. They could have gone off and done what Jenson Button did, or done DTM, or done WAC, but they haven't. These are two superstars of motorsport who've said, I want to go in Formula E. That's great for the sport.
And of course, we're seeing young guns, the F2 runners and GP3 drivers who are eyeing up Formula E as their safety net if they don't make it into Formula One, which of course for the vast majority of drivers is very likely.
Well, Formula E doesn't need to feel insulted by that. To be the safety net of the pinnacle of single-seater racing is a pretty good position to be in. So what about the other lad then, Massa? You know how much of a huge fan I am of Felipe Massa.
he had a nightmare debut. Really,
Oh,
really
no!
unfortunate.
Oh, poor Massa. I can't believe it. Did he
No.
beat his chest at the end of the race and gain the adoration of the fans?
Of course, his qualifying that was blocked, as I mentioned, and then he received the regen penalty, the same as Vernon and Lotterer, and then also picked up 2 post-race penalties as well for using too much energy and power when he was using fan boost. In terms of his performance, though, very, very solid. He got his elbows out a little bit. I wasn't expecting that from the old boy, but no, he seemed to assimilate with Formula E quite well.
I'm laughing because if you've watched the whole of Massa's career, him getting his elbows out is something that you would entirely expect.
Yeah, I was going to say, I wouldn't be surprised by him being fighty. I don't think him being fighty has ever been the problem.
No, it's never been the problem. And you mentioned Gary Paffett. I'll tell you one other thing that really surprised me was that Nissan did much better than we were thinking they might do. With all the talk about their engines and this and that and the other, at the end of the day, there was Buemi in the top 5 fighting for position.
He was in the top 5, but he was P2 at the start of the race and ended up, P6 across the line, and that worries him, I think, because he did nothing but slip back in the race. I sort of alluded to it earlier. He was going through energy quicker than the cars around him. Now, again, I'm not making any foregone conclusions based off of this race, but it wasn't the most promising of starts. Of course, they've got very big shoes to fill from where Renault left off. That the manufacturer that won at least one of the championships in every single season of Formula E so far, be it the drivers or the teams or both, in one scenario. So it's tough for them. I almost expected more from them, but it does seem like they've got a little bit of work to do.
Well, of course, Buemi, as he's been so sure of himself and confident, not in the best car anymore, he'll still come through and triumph, won't he, Buemi? That likeable chap of Formula E. Everybody's, hang on, how many people are there on the grid? Everybody's 22nd favourite FE driver, Buemi, surely will triumph over this adversity.
Well, we saw him really struggle last season in a car that wasn't fully optimized. I mean, when you're being beaten by your customer team, that's a really big sign that something's really, really wrong. And we saw Buemi it was his worst FE season. These errors that you don't see from him when he's at his peak really, really crept to the surface, and he was throwing away results. Now, don't get me wrong, very quick, 3 pole positions in that season. So the raw speed is still there. The old Buemi magic lingers a little bit, but he did really, really struggle. And I really hope for his sake that it doesn't get as bad as that this season, because he is one of the gems of the Formula E field.
He is. And I honestly felt that Renault pretty much just did nothing last year because they knew Nissan was coming in. Like, they sort of like, oh yeah, we'll send the people, you do the things. But it didn't feel like that team had the same kind of attention last year that it had had in previous years. And I think partly that's down to Prost being preoccupied with Formula One matters. And also because they knew that Nissan was coming on board. And they're like, well, we don't want to step on, maybe they were thinking, we don't want to step on their toes. We'll leave it to them. But that basically, I feel like they're a year behind in development relative to the other teams against which they're competing. And to me, I get it's a bad sign that he dropped back, but it's a good sign that someone that we've known as a potential winner of the championship was that close in a team that wasn't coming in the same way a lot of other teams were.
The thing is, you can't point the finger at the powertrain, because that powertrain won the Drivers' Championship for Jean-Eric Vergne. So there was something in what the team itself was doing. And of course, with Nissan coming over there, brand new hardware and all, there's a few things that could be going wrong there. So they need to get to the crux of what the biggest issue is and start putting out some very small fires.
Right, they do. So before we move on, is there anything else that you want to get to from the race proper?
Yes, just to finish up on the rookies, Gary Paffett, his debut ended when he hit the wall at turn 8. Very unfortunate. And Oliver Rowland, much happier than Buemi, actually, because he, of course, was one of the drivers who was thrown to the back of the grid after qualifying. So he came from 14th to 7th, which is quite impressive for a first race. I will say it was a great race by Lopez as well. As cracking as that qualifying lap was, it was a great race from him as well, right up there in podium contention until he had the left rear suspension failure. So heart goes out to them. Very encouraging start for them. Mitch Evans, the silent hunter, I'm calling him, because he was P12 in qualifying, started 8th with all the penalties and got up to 4th and was really knocking on the door of the podium. And nobody had really said anything about him all day. So, again, the actual podium still lingers for Mitch Evans, which is very frustrating. Eduardo Mortara, we mentioned him earlier, marred by brake issues in qualifying and in the race. He was a lap down after he pitted for a new front wing on lap 1, so that ruined his day. Neo's race was pretty much compromised from qualifying, so no points on either car, which is probably not what they deserve. And Felix Rosenqvist, he retired from the race after having the same transmission issue he had in qualifying that caused him to go into the wall.
Okay. Question. Did you come to any numerical benefit for actual attack mode or not?
What, is it putting a specific figure on it? Oh, there's no way. There's no way. It really so much depends on how much traffic you're in.
Well, it was interesting. I watched, because you mentioned Mitch Evans. He was the only time that you could actually compare when he started his attack mode and when he finished. And he gained about 5 seconds on the leaders in that time. So I think it's going to be very interesting to see as the teams get to use it as a tactical weapon. Because right now it's like, let's wait to the end and get rid of it because we don't want to compromise our race. But as they start to understand it better, I think it's really going to make some things very, very interesting.
I can only go by the evidence of my eyes. And to me, I didn't even bother looking at the timings. It seemed so obvious that the cars in attack mode would have an advantage once they'd done the admin and taken the pain of going into the little box. Obviously, it was worse if you missed it, Lopez. But once they'd gone through that pain, they then had an advantage for the remaining 4 minutes of that time. The only time it messed you up is if you had cars behind you and you sacrificed a place. But I think that it seemed very obvious that that attack mode, if used in the correct mode, gains you time. Absolutely. Hand over fist gains you time.
The thing, it's tough to learn from attack mode because the amount of time you're allowed to use it for and how many times you have to use it in a race and how much time you'll lose taking the Joker section, as it were, is going to change every single race, and those details aren't going to come up until an hour before the race. So that's why they're doing it, to keep the spice element in there and just stop teams calculating the advantage.
As a race goes on, you might get the situation where you've got somebody at the front of a train who says, oh my goodness, I've got to use my attack mode soon. I'm not as fast as the cars behind, but I've got track position. I'm going to have to use more energy now to give myself enough space to use attack mode and come back out in front. Because if they get the place back, even with attack mode, I'm not going to have the pace to get them back. So attack mode could end up being a hindrance if you don't, like you said, get rid of it early. You suddenly go, oh man, I have to play this game of chicken, hoping they're going to use their attack mode first to like come at me, and then when they lose time using their attack mode, maybe I can use more energy, build up enough of a gap, and then be able to use my attack mode and still come out in front. Like, I love the strategy of this. It's great. And remember, Chris, there's no pit stops. There's none of that kind of F1 style undercut overcut. This is a really good substitute for that.
Yeah, power modes would have been fine in my opinion, but I was surprised actually that people took it before the fan boost results were coming in, because you can only use fan boost while you're using attack mode. So why would you use your 225 kilos when you could have had potentially 250 kilowatts of power? But apparently, because I guess because you were allowed to use it twice, they would use one early and then one after the fan boost result came out. But I was surprised to see cars taking it before the fan boost results.
All right, I love this, and I will point out for the benefit of anyone who is confused, the fact that Formula One has a mandatory pit stop and then requires 2 different kinds of tires to be used is exactly the same kind of gimmick as attack mode.
Yep.
And
yep, it's a great point.
yeah, it kind of is. I mean, when you think about it that way, you're like, yeah, it sort of kind of is. All right, so on to any other business before we wrap this thing up.
Well, I have one, sir.
All right.
The broadcast. Last time I left the broadcast, it was in absolute dire straits. Things were going wrong that you would not expect from a normal broadcast. I didn't like Channel 5's handling of it at all. I was hoping that it would take a bigger leap forward than it has done. Chris, do you think these are teething problems? Because not just me, there were some difficult moments in that broadcast.
Yeah, no, definitely. There were definitely a few technical issues why it ended up happening. I mean, Jack fully admitted after the race that he couldn't hear the team radio, and so that's why he was like talking over it and stuff.
There's an issue with the commentators, not with the individuals. Jack Nicholls is one of the, if not the best commentator of modern times. When we're looking back at motorsport in 30 years' time, the name Jack Nicholls will be synonymous with exciting commentary throughout F1 and single seaters and FIA stuff. No problem with Jack Nicholls at all. Bob Varsha is a legend. It's been on Missed Apex podcast. Like, what a guy, what a great voice. Franchitti is unfortunately stuck in no man's land. Now, I've got the feeling, and I'm not too sure, that they are all commentating from different places. The feeling I've got is that Varsha, and I might be wrong on this, I'm just guessing, that Varsha is commentating from France, Jack from London, and Franchitti from On Location. Now, what you've got is Jack Nicholls being a classic colour commentator. So he's the, oh, here we go, you know, Murray Walker, but better. We've got Bob Varsha, who is making his sly points, not sly points, that's the wrong word. He's making his observations. He's coming in with things to look out for. He's being very kind of laid back and seeing the big picture. But what you've got is Franchitti in the middle, who would kind of like to be a colour commentator as well, but is actually meant to be there to be that secondary role supporting Jack Nicholls. So when something interesting and exciting happens on the track, Jack is springing into colour commentator mode, and Franchitti is over the top of him. And because they're not in the same locations, something just isn't quite gelling. So, for example, when I'm sat next to our very own Jake Sanson, and he's doing karting commentary, he's very much the colour commentator. If something mental happens on track, I don't react to that. I elbow him as hard as I can and point him in that direction. For me, what I'd like to see, and that's no offence to Franchitti at all, his analysis and presenting and everything before and after the race is great. I would like to see Jack Nicholls doing the full-on colour commentary with Bob Varsha coming in with observations. I spoke for ages there, sorry.
Chris?
My only complaint really is just the fact that the live team radio is still a thing, because it just doesn't work as a concept, because they open up the team radio and nothing gets said, and if they do say anything, it's a bunch of numbers that don't mean anything. And more often than not, if they do say something important, the commentators will still be talking anyway. Not because they haven't heard it, but because you literally can't react to someone talking over you that quickly, can you? And now it's got little sound effect beeps with it as well. What's that about?
You get the feeling that they perhaps just don't have the vast production team that the F1 broadcast has, and we've been somewhat spoiled, because F1 will have someone, in fact, I bet they've got a whole little department dedicated to listening to the team radio, finding something interesting, picking that out, cutting it into a sound clip, and then pressing the button on the behest of the live feed producer. Whereas Formula E, they probably don't have that resource, so they go, yeah, just let all the team radio go out.
Yeah, no, I'd much prefer the more traditional, slightly delayed team radio is more than adequate.
Right. Well, I was fortunate enough to watch Formula One in the States, and the team of Matchett, Hobbs, and Varsha was the one that I got to watch. And it is possible to have 3 people on a broadcast and have it work, But what they all said about that in various different venues was that they had a director and their roles were incredibly clear as to what they were doing. And I just wonder if whoever's in charge of this is still maybe trying to feel that out a little bit.
I don't know, that situation with Varsha seeming a bit detached, that's been happening for a couple of seasons now. I would like to see Varsha as just the clear number 2 alongside Jack, because otherwise you're wasting Bob Varsha. You know, he is a magnificent caller.
Yeah, no, I agree wholeheartedly. But in light of the fact that there is other business to get onto, shall we get onto it? Chris, anything else you want to mention before we say good night?
How about the awards we have, which we can finally do because we've had a race?
Indeed. Shall we move to the awards? Let's move to the awards. All right. So, Chris Stevens, what or who was your thing of the weekend?
My thing of the weekend is going to be Van Dorn's qualifying lap. Properly impressive. And the glimpses of that dominant GP2 champion Van Dorn that I know is lingering in there, and he just needs a platform to display him on.
All right. What about you, Spanners? You watched the race. Surely you have a thing.
Just John Eric Verne's synergy with his car and the way he was able to handle it under braking and really attack people. I'm looking forward to seeing what he can really do.
Well, I'll tell you my thing of the week, and this is going to be a surprise, but my thing of the week was, well, the actual track. I mean, it was a purpose-built track for Formula E, and I got to say, they got it pretty right. It was exciting to watch the cars. There was places for overtaking, and there were definitely places where you could put yourself into serious danger. So congratulations on building a decent track. As we've seen in the past, it does not always happen in locations like this.
I will second that. It was a quality track, unique amongst Formula E circuits in that it was quite high speed, very flowing. You know, there was S's section, Suzuka without the walls, they described it as. Very different to anything the Formula E has done before. I like the fact that they went for that. Very cool track.
And I also like the fact that it could go from wet to dusty with nothing in between.
Yeah, we were still talking about like the potential first wet Formula E race. Of course, it didn't happen. Still, as wet as qualifying was.
Yeah, I mean, there was still water on the track, and where it was drying, it was dusty. It was spectacular. Must have been a real handful for the poor drivers. But I'll tell you, I'm surprised neither of you mentioned the new batteries, because wow, did they ever work exactly as promised? I mean, how much energy did they have left at the end of that race?
Oh, I can tell you, probably loads because of the safety car.
Great, let's make them half the size, since the regen obviously works fantastic, and the cars will be 150 kilos lighter. All right, fine. Spanners, who missed the apex for you?
Oh, we're doing a bad negativity thing award.
Well, in your honor, yes.
Woohoo! Okay. So, by the way, firstly, if you want a wet race, just have a Welsh E-Prix. It's an absolute no-brainer, guys. Matt, for your knowledge, it rains, I think, 147% of the time in Wales. So we definitely see that. So bad thing, let's see now. I would give it to Lopez, because all you had to do was drive into the attack thingy and hit the first line and then hit the second line. And had he only missed it once, I think I could forgive it. But I think he missed it twice.
I think you may be right. What about you, Chris?
I was going to give it to the team simulators, but that seems incredibly harsh because everyone was caught out by the track being more undulating and bumpier than they expected. But yeah, I'll give it to that. Didn't see that one coming.
Well, I'm going to have to give it out to the live stream, because although I watched it afterwards on YouTube, which I was able to do from my own country in case anybody wants to complain about it. The chaos regarding the YouTube stream that I saw going down on Twitter while the race was live was legendary. And the only thing I can say is, well, you know, I subscribe to Formula One TV, so I feel your pain on that one. Hopefully, they're on the same kind of development curve with that as they were with Formula One TV, which now mostly works kind of the way it should. And last, do we have any ponies? Anyone?
Well, the chat room might be a contender for pony, because he said, so to conclude, Formula E drivers can't reverse or drive between the clearly marked lines. So he might be giving the pony award to all of them. I have to admit, I couldn't hear any team radio, and I couldn't really make out what everybody's saying. But maybe I will give us a minor pony award to John Eric Verne, who, having dominated the race and seemed by far the fastest car driver combination, and only had really been robbed by that penalty, why couldn't you be happier on the podium? Like, he looked proper miserable. I know you missed out on the win, but in race one of a season, when you've shown yourself to be that powerful against your opposition, you've got a lot to be happy about.
Well, he is. Well, no, I'm not going to say it because you'll just say it's racist. Never mind. All right, that takes care of that. Do we have a comment of the week?
Yes, of course we do. I wouldn't be in charge of the chat room and then not give out a comment of the week. That would be ridiculous, wouldn't it, Matt?
It would be ridiculous. And since you happen to have one and you're not rapidly scrolling back through, I'm just going to take the exceeding amount of time to announce in advance my action of playing this bumper.
Comment of the week.
Comment of the week goes to Richard Mundell. So, to conclude, FE drivers can't reverse or drive between the clearly marked lines.
Well, there you have it. Literally the last comment before
you make
I asked
it seem so easy on Missed Apex, Matt. I just forgot. I'm sorry.
That's okay. It doesn't matter. It's actually a really good comment. So congratulations, Richard Mundell. You've won.
Comment of the week.
Literally the last comment.
Sorry. I couldn't resist when I saw it. It was just there. All right. So it is time for all of the plugging. Mr. Spanners, where can we find you? What are you up to?
I would like everybody to stick with Missed Apex podcast through the off season. And if you want to talk to me, you can. On Twitter, @SpannersReady. You can DM me. My DMs are always open. Slide on in there. And on Facebook, I have a Spanners Ready account. So search that. You can also DM me on there and have a chat with me. Ask me my opinions or just ask me what time it is. I always know what time it is.
Brilliant. Stevens, what about you? What are you up to?
You can follow me on Twitter @cstevens_journo. And all of my written works, my podcast appearances, everything I do, plus a few extra little bits, can be found on my own website, ejournoonline.com.
Excellent. As for me, I'm @MattPT55. Come find me on the Twitters and tell me how wrong I am about life, the universe, and everything. And don't forget, you can catch us on Twitter @eRadioShow. We really have a Twitter account, and we occasionally tweet things from it. If you are part of our Missed Apex Slack group, be sure to join #Formula-E as well. And remember, chicks dig heels, wounds cause scars, and glory is a fungible concept under certain philosophical precepts. This has been eRadio Show.